when an empath stops pleasing everyone and starts seeing the truth. Carl Jung discovered something remarkable happens. They don't become selfish, they become dangerous, not to others, but to every system that profits from their endless giving. Jung called this transformation individuation, and it's the most threatening thing an empath can achieve in a world built on their self-sacrifice. Picture the moment everything changes. You're sitting alone, maybe after another exhausting day of managing everyone else's emotions. You've said yes when you meant no. You've smiled through your pain to keep others comfortable. You've absorbed their stress until your nervous system feels like it's on fire. But something different happens this time. Instead of pushing through, you pause. You ask a question that changes everything. What if I stopped? That question is what Jung called the beginning of consciousness. And for the empath who dares to answer it honestly, there's no going back to ignorance. But here's what Jung discovered that no one talks about. The empath's gift of feeling everything isn't actually a gift at all. It's what I call survival sensitivity, a trauma response disguised as compassion. Jung observed this pattern repeatedly in his practice. He wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But empaths can't become who they truly are because they've never learned who they are without others' emotions. Let me tell you what really happens in that first moment of awakening. The empath doesn't gradually become more self-aware. They experience what Jung called the collision with the unconscious, a sudden shocking recognition that their entire identity is built on a lie, the lie that they are responsible for everyone else's feelings. Jung documented this exact pattern in his work on individuation. He found that highly sensitive people often develop what he called inflated compassion. They become addicted to being needed because it's the only way they learn to feel valuable. But when this bubble bursts, something extraordinary happens. The real self begins to emerge. This is where Jung's work becomes revolutionary for empaths. He discovered that every person carries what he called the shadow, all the parts of ourselves we've rejected or hidden. But for empaths, the shadow contains something others don't expect: rage, pure, undiluted rage at being used, manipulated, and taken for granted. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." For empaths, this darkness isn't evil. It's their suppressed anger, their denied needs, their silenced voice. And when they finally meet this shadow, everything shifts. The empath who discovers their shadow doesn't become cruel. They become what I call consciously selective. They start seeing manipulation tactics that were invisible before. They recognize emotional vampires. They spot the difference between genuine need and manufactured crisis. This isn't cynicism, it's clarity. Jung identified specific patterns when highly sensitive people begin individuation, what I call the 8 signs of conscious awakening. And if you recognize these in yourself, you're experiencing what Jung called the birth of psychological sovereignty. The first sign is what I call the energy reversal. Instead of your energy flowing outward to everyone else, it starts pooling back toward you. Jung observed this in his patients. When people stop unconsciously giving their life force away, they suddenly have energy for themselves. You stop feeling drained after social interactions. You stop absorbing everyone's bad moods. Most importantly, you stop feeling guilty about having boundaries. Jung wrote, "Your vision becomes clear when you look into your heart. Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakens." Others notice this shift before you do. They sense that you're no longer available to be their emotional dumping ground. The second sign is the mask falling away. Jung called it the death of the persona, the social mask we wear to fit in. For empaths, this persona is usually the nice one, the helpful one, the one who never says no. But when individuation begins, this mask becomes impossible to maintain. You start saying what you actually think instead of what people want to hear. You express preferences instead of always deferring to others. You admit when you're tired instead of pretending to have endless energy. This terrifies people who benefited from your self-erasure. Jung warned about this phase. The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. But for the awakening empath, self-acceptance becomes more important than social acceptance. The third sign is what I call projection recall. Jung discovered that we often project our own qualities onto others. Empaths project their sensitivity, their depth, their capacity for genuine care onto people who don't actually possess these qualities. But during individuation, this projection collapses. You stop seeing potential in people and start seeing reality. You stop making excuses for bad behavior. You stop believing that everyone is just misunderstood deep down. Jung wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." The awakening empath realizes they were irritated by selfishness because they had suppressed their own healthy selfishness for so long. The fourth sign is that boundaries become sacred. Jung observed that individuals who achieve psychological maturity develop what he called a personal relationship with the unconscious. For empaths, this means they finally start listening to their internal signals instead of external demands. You begin saying no without elaborate explanations. You stop feeling guilty for having needs. You recognize that people who get angry at your boundaries were benefiting from your lack of them. This isn't selfishness. Jung called it individual integrity. The awakening empath discovers what I call sacred selfishness. The understanding that taking care of yourself isn't just okay. It's necessary for authentic relationship with others. The fifth sign is that guilt disappears. This might be the most shocking sign for empaths. The crushing guilt they've carried for having needs, taking space, or disappointing others begins to evaporate. Jung called this the integration of the shadow. When you stop rejecting parts of yourself, you stop feeling guilty for being human. You realize that guilt was often your response to other people's manipulation tactics. When someone says you've changed in a disappointed tone, instead of rushing to reassure them, you think, yes, I have, and that's the point. The sixth sign is choosing authenticity over approval. Jung's individuation process leads to what he called self-actualization, living from your authentic core rather than from external expectations. For empaths, this means choosing authenticity over approval, even when it costs relationships. You stop performing emotions you don't feel. You stop pretending to agree when you don't. You stop laughing at jokes that aren't funny just to make others comfortable. This authenticity is magnetic to some people and threatening to others. The awakening empath learns what I call authentic magnetism. When you stop trying to be liked by everyone, you become genuinely attractive to the right people. The seventh sign is that the healer heals themselves. Jung discovered that many healers are what he called wounded healers. They help others to avoid their own pain. But during individuation, empaths turn their healing gifts inward for the first time. You start asking, what do I need? Instead of, what does everyone else need? You begin nurturing your own inner child instead of parenting every adult around you. You recognize that you can't give from an empty cup, and you've been empty for years. The seventh sign is that the healer heals themselves. Jung discovered that many healers are what he called wounded healers. They help others to avoid their own pain. But during individuation, empaths turn their healing gifts inward for the first time. You start asking, what do I need? Instead of, what does everyone else need? You begin nurturing your own inner child instead of parenting every adult around you. You recognize that you can't give from an empty cup, and you've been empty for years. Jung wrote, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. The awakening empath, finally, gives themselves permission to discover who that is, separate from their role as everyone's emotional caretaker. The eighth sign is conscious connection. The awakening empath develops what I call boundaried compassion. You can feel for others without taking on their emotions. You start attracting people who respect your boundaries instead of those who exploit your kindness. You develop relationships based on mutual respect rather than one-sided giving. You love others without needing to save them. Jung observed that individuation leads to deeper, more authentic connections because you're finally relating as your true self, not your performing self. But he didn't romanticize this process. He called it the night sea journey, a period of disorientation and loss that's necessary for rebirth. For empaths, this phase feels like death, because in many ways it is. It's the death of the false self that was built around pleasing others. You might lose friends who only liked the version of you that served them. You might feel lonely as you learn to be alone with yourself for the first time. You might grieve relationships that were never really based on love, but on your usefulness. Jung wrote, no tree, it is said, can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell. The awakening empath must descend into their own psychological underworld before they can rise into authentic selfhood. Jung was one of the first psychologists to recognize the connection between mind and body. For empaths, years of absorbing others' emotions creates what I call energetic toxicity, chronic fatigue, anxiety, digestive issues, and autoimmune problems. But when empaths stop people-pleasing, their bodies begin to heal. The nervous system finally relaxes, sleep improves, chronic pain often diminishes. Jung understood that psychological healing and physical healing are inseparable. As individuation continues, relationships change. Some deepen, others fall away. This sorting process can be painful but necessary. What I call the great relationship purge. People who truly love you will adapt to your boundaries and celebrate your growth. Those who resist your changes were probably benefiting from your self-neglect. Jung called this the differentiation between genuine love and neurotic attachment. Ultimately, when empaths stop being everyone's emotional sponge, they don't lose their sensitivity. They develop what I call conscious sensitivity. They can still feel deeply, but they choose what to absorb and what to release. This becomes a superpower. You can read situations accurately without being overwhelmed. You can help others without depleting yourself. You can love deeply without losing yourself. Jung called this differentiated consciousness, the ability to maintain your center while connecting with others. The awakening empath becomes what Jung called a conscious individual, someone who can navigate the world with their sensitivity intact, but their boundaries strong. Jung believed that individual transformation creates collective change. When one person becomes conscious, it gives others permission to do the same. The empath who stops people-pleasing doesn't just change their own life. They model a different way of being for everyone around them. Your courage to set boundaries gives others courage to set theirs.